Okay, hey everybody, so we're back. We just got finished doing the peristernal long axis view and the peristernal short axis view. So now we're going to do our next one, which is the third of our 4 views, the apical 4 chamber. So again, we have our ultrasound probe here. Here's our indicator that lines up with the dot on the screen. I'm going to take my indicator and probe, and I'm going to put it, kind of try to find right the apex of the heart. So a lot of times that's kind of the mid-clavicular line, often just below the nipple, and the indicator is pointed towards the patient's left. So this is where I kind of landed here. This is not a bad image. We can optimize it a little bit. So the first thing I'll say is that my depth is a little bit off because I'm cutting off part of the right atrium here. So I'm just going to go in, look on depth again. Maybe I won't because this is the depth is already optimized. So we're cutting off a little bit of the left atrium, of the right atrium, but it's fine. We can see the ventricles just fine. The other thing I'll say is the left atrium, left ventricle are the center of the screen, which is okay for looking at the left atrium and left ventricle. If you wanted to look at the right ventricle, then I can swing the image by dropping down the tail of my probe to include more of the right ventricle, which is over here. I'm just going to drop the tail down and you can see the image swing so that the right ventricle gets more towards the center of the screen. So this is a reasonably good view that we have here right now. You can see both ventricles. A couple points, because it can be a little bit confusing as far as which ventricle is which sometimes. I know you can use the indicator, but we sometimes forget. In a typical normal heart, the left ventricle should dominate the apex. So that is the ventricle that reaches the apex. The other thing is that the left ventricle, again, in a normal heart, should be larger than the right ventricle, which it is here. And then if you look at the mitral and the tricuspid valve, the tricuspid valve should always be closer to the apex than the mitral valve. So because the tricuspid valve is closer to the apex here, I know that this is the right ventricle, this is the left ventricle. So things we're focusing on in this view, just kind of broadly speaking, one is what is the left ventricular ejection fraction, and just grossly, above or below 40%, 50% is a good thing for us to be able to eyeball here without making specific measurements. 2, what is the size of the right ventricle? So when we eyeball it, the right ventricle should be about 2/3 the size of the left ventricle or smaller. If it's the same size as the left ventricle, it's probably enlarged. You can actually measure the right ventricle during various phases, but we're not going to get into that during this video. And then 3, looking for pericardial effusions, again, is a good thing to do from this view. Obviously, pericardial effusion would show up as fluid, so black on the echo screen, and then be surrounding the heart on the outside. We can't see the posterior wall as very well in this, the posterior portion of the heart very well with this view, just because of our depth is limiting. But that's really it for the apical 4 chamber.
Can you show us a foreshortened apical 4?
Yeah, for sure. So what Spencer is saying is that a lot of times when we put the indicator probe on, we might have the probe angled in kind of a funny way, and so you might see something like this. I'm gonna try to tilt it without getting the ribs in.
He's just too good.
That is definitely not true. Let me try. Actually, let's do this.
Perfect, that's exactly.
This is kind of okay. Well, it's not okay. This is kind of the foreshortened view. So what's happening basically is, and again, I think it's a little bit easier if you look on this 3D screen, is the ultrasound probe, the plane of the probe, is basically clipping a portion of the heart, and it's making it look like the heart is like collapsing with every heartbeat, and it's basically overestimating your left ventricular ejection fraction. So it's creating, in a way, kind of an artifact to lead you to believe that the function is better than it is. So what you want to do is really make sure that you're opening up as much of the ventricle as you can, and you do that just by making really slight, small adjustments so that you can see as much of the ventricle as possible.
And another way to assess whether you're foreshortened is what is taking up the majority of the apex. And so, as previously mentioned, the left ventricle should make up the apex. If the RV is making up the apex, then you know you're foreshortened.